We know this is sort of a chance for these regional neighbours to sort of manage their relationships, especially when you've got that backdrop of tensions between China and the US. So what's on the agenda exactly?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about because, as you said, this summit hasn't been held since 2019, and that's partly because of the pandemic, but also partly because of resistance from Beijing. It has been watching this growing relations between Korea, Japan, and the US with some level of wariness. And I think what really took on increased urgency for these three countries to meet now is because Korea, Japan, and the US, they held their very own trilateral summit in Camp David in August of last year, and that really set alarm bells ringing in Beijing because those three countries, they had committed to, reaffirm their economic and security cooperation. So Premier Li Qiang is going to use this trip to really shore up Beijing's own security. And I'm talking about military security and economic security because we know Washington has been courting Korea and Japan to kind of expand their curbs on the export of chip-making equipment to China at a time when China already faces a wall of restrictions from the US, the Dutch, and Japan as well. So there is a lot at stake here, not just for China, but also for Korea and Japan, because Korea is the largest provider of chips to China. Japan is the largest provider of silicon wafers to China. And there are big companies like Samsung, SK Hynix with huge presence in China. They would be worried about retaliation. And time is also of the essence here because Washington is said to be pushing to reach an agreement with Korea by June before the G7 summit. And then the Japanese and Korean leaders, they're looking to perhaps visit the US to have another trilateral summit with President Joe Biden, maybe in July. So there's a lot of negotiations going on ahead of those meetings.
Complexity on just about every front, right? Because China's also the biggest benefactor of North Korea. China's also been, militarily very present across the region. So how do sort of those issues get dealt with?
Yeah, military is a big deal as well because we see Korea, Japan, and the US kind of strengthening this defense mechanism. They have been holding joint drills in the East China Sea, and that's where China has territorial dispute with Japan over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, depending on who you speak to. They have different names for these islands. And then North Korea, as you said, that's always a concern, especially for South Korea, its nuclear missile program, and that allegations of this weapons for aid exchange with Moscow that's aiding the war in Ukraine. Now, both Moscow and Pyongyang have denied this, but Korea and Japan are likely to push Beijing to use its leverage over Kim Jong-un to really rein Pyongyang in. So there are a lot of contentious issues here, but the good news is the three countries are still looking to adopt a joint declaration out of the summit, detailing some of the outcomes. We could look at perhaps progress in people-to-people exchanges, collaboration in dealing with infectious diseases, climate change, as well as trade and investment.
There are really quite high hopes for this as well, at least from the Korean side, because they're expressing hope that perhaps this could sort of serve as a turning point and this sort of three-way cooperation could be a full normalization of relations again. Is that sort of realistic, do you think?
Yeah, I think we're at a time where, since they last met in 2019, so much has changed, and you really feel kind of this shifting of the geopolitical dynamics. Because if you take a look, let's pull out that chart of the trade numbers there. China is still the largest trading partner for both Korea and Japan. But if you look at new investments, that's already dropping from both Korea and Japan in recent times. And Korea's exports to the US had overtaken its exports to China for the first time in over 2 decades. So it feels like the ground is shifting under Beijing's feet, and there's a lot for these countries to navigate. But at the same time, Korea and Japan, they're not likely to want to antagonize China as well because it's, after all, the closest neighbor. The Chinese have a saying, 吞王齿寒. It literally means your teeth will be cold if your lips die. So it just means that your closer neighbors are still more important than your allies that are far away.